Uh, Thank you, Paul, for your introduction. So the title of my talk is Nietzsche and the Theatre of the Absurd. Introduction. Martin Esslin in 1961, in his seminal work, The Theatre of the Absurd, classified the then existing works of Beckett, Ionesco, Adamov, Genet, and a number of other avant-garde writers from France, Britain, Italy, Spain, Germany, America into a new category of the absurdist theatre. The unifying theme that ran across the works of the above playwrights was that of absurdity of human existence, which the theatre presented both in subject matter and form. However, Estlin has argued that this theme did not exhaust the length and breadth of the works of these playwrights. Philosophically, the theatre of the absurd borrowed from the famous existentialist theme of absurdity, which is reflected upon in the works of Sartre and Camus. The myth of Sisyphus specifically, Camus argued for the inherent meaninglessness of life that stemmed from the absence of any religious, metaphysical, or transcendental certitudes. The widespread destruction of the two world wars that exposed the shallowness of secular nationalism, the imminent threat of annihilation in the wake of proliferation of nuclear weapons, had materially thrust man to face the precariousness of his own existence. The theatre of the absurd pictures this post-war figure of man troubled with the burden of his own existence. But what is this category of the theatre of absurd? Within the theatrical history, the category of the absurd theatre is understood as opposed to both the conventional and the existential theatre. A plot with a beginning, middle, and end, consistent characters and language used for communicating the inner and the outer world of man are some of the characteristics of the conventional dramatic theatre. However, the theatre of the absurd repudiates all these characteristics and, in contrast, is surreal, illogical, plotless, conflictless, and based on a total de-evaluation of language as a means of communication. The existential theatre of both Sartre and Camus arrests the absurdity and sheer senselessness of human existence through the conventional structures of dramatic form. On the contrary, the theatre of the absurd is a radical presentation of absurdism. The theatre of the absurd borrows from various traditions of pure theatre, tragic comedy, nonsense plays, silent film, Dadaism, expressionism, works of Kafka, Dostoevsky, etc. Similarly, Nietzsche's ideas have acted as an important precursor to the theatre of the absurd. Nietzsche was the first to have proclaimed the death of God. His primary focus here was not to argue against the existence of God, but to explain what it means for God to be dead. It is in a godless universe, devoid of not just religious, metaphysical, and transcendental certitudes, but essentially stripped of all ultimate truths, that man faces the infinite sea of nothingness. The sacrifice of God at man's hands leads us towards the possibility of nihilism. The nothingness, however, is encountered in the wake of a reevaluation of values, which ultimately leads to an overcoming of man himself. The theatre of the absurd resonates with the Nietzschean ideal of presenting what it means for God to be dead. That is a universe devoid of all certitudes, which is chaotic, which is brimming profusely with nothingness. This paper is an attempt to study Nietzsche's nihilism in the theatre of absurd, specifically through three works: Beckett's Waiting for Godot, Ionesco's The Chairs, and Genet's The Balcony. The aim is to probe if the theatre of the absurd goes through a reevaluation of values and if there is an overcoming of the nihilist condition of man or not. This will be attempted by delineating Nietzsche's nihilism and the centrality of will to power in his reevaluation of values in the first section. In the section 2, through the three prominent works that I have already mentioned, I will argue that though the theatre of the absurd presents the nihilist condition of man, it, however, evades resolving the problem. The first section, that is Nietzsche and nihilism. Nietzsche in the gay sciences proclaimed the death of God via his madmen. I quote, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him." He echoes the same sentiment in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, when Zarathustra meets a hermit while descending from the mountains, who makes up songs and sings it in the praise of God, to which Zarathustra whispers, "Can it be possible? This old saint in the forest has not yet heard that God is dead." Nietzsche calls God, I quote, the holiest and the most powerful of all that the world has yet possessed, and his death as, I quote, the prodigious event. But what does the death of the holiest and the mightiest symbol imply for a mortal's world? As the ultimate symbol of transcendence, God's death implies a religious vacuum. However, his death has far wider implications rather than just the religious ones, for God also acted as a symbol of truth and reality and as a reference point for all the moral systems exemplified in the Christian ethics. Therefore, the death of God also extends to the metaphysical and moral realm, implying the crumbling of fixed absolute truths and values. As a consequence of a world devoid of absolute truth, nihilism seems a logical possibility. In general terms, nihilism is understood as a negation of all meaning and value in life. Apparently, Nietzsche seems to be arguing for a nihilism with the death of God. However, Nietzschean nihilism is not as simple as delineated above. Nietzsche calls nihilism the history of Europe for the next 2 centuries, a history that has already been necessitated by a chain of events. Nihilism is the catastrophe that plagued the Western culture. His nihilism can be understood in twofold ways, and I am borrowing this from Deleuze's twofold understanding of nihilism in his book Nietzsche and Philosophy. First, the traditional values they become a source of perpetuating a nihilism through their life-denying project. Nietzsche argues that Christianity is a nihilist religion, one that is turned against life itself. Second, it is the highest values devaluating themselves. The traditional values that provided certainty to man's existence lose all significance, and as a result, life appears devoid of all meaning. Nihilism, in both the senses, acts as a structure of power. In the latter case, a belief in the absolute idol of nothingness denies life, while in the former case, a nihilistic religion acts in order to incarcerate the human spirit and seek subservience in the name of God. Historically, religions have been the biggest enemies of mankind in denying life over a preference to transcendental principles in order to exercise power over man. There is a fundamental difference between Nietzsche's nihilism and Sartre's notion of nothingness. Sartre's nothingness is an ontological reality whose experience at the individual level makes one nauseated. His protagonist, Roquentin, on finding himself alienated in a world of objects, feels nauseous at the very absurdity and uncertainty of his own existence. Nietzsche, on the other hand, recognizes nihilism as a pathological transitional stage. What is peculiar then about Nietzsche is that nihilism is not an objective state of being, rather a necessary state, individually and culturally, that is to be overcome. The idea that is then central to understand nihilism as a transitional stage rather than an end in itself is the will to power. Nietzsche contends, I quote, "The world is the will to power and nothing besides, and you yourself are also this will to power and nothing besides." Absolutely everything, whether the external world, an individual subject, or the human constructs, can be explained through the idea of the will to power. The will to power is the force that explains the world of constant becoming through opposition and negativity. It necessarily involves an idea of overcoming the present state through its denial towards an affirmation of a new meaning or value. Therefore, it acts as a principle of synthesis of different forces. In the first sense of nihilism as denial of life over the fictive cosmos of higher values, the will to power as the will to deny acts as a precursor to the higher values devaluating themselves. Similarly, the will to power as will to truth guides the devaluation of all higher values. However, this stage of nihilism is a temporary stage which can be overcome through one's will to power that leads to the revaluation. The will to power avoids the kind of total devaluation of the world of constant flux that is a consequence of twofold understanding of nihilism. It is, however, both an affirmation and a continuation of the world of becoming. But what stronger values replace the decadent traditional value systems? According to Nietzsche, the new values are based on an affirmation of life, saying a yes rather than a no to life. It reinstates all that the Christian moral God denounced and recenters man as a locus of all creation. It is a return to the natural morality of man, the master morality that is noble, grand, virile, and a kind of an aristocracy. I come to the second part of the paper, the theater of the absurd, Beckett, Ionesco, and Jelinek. According to Estlin, absurdism, I quote, is the inevitable devaluation of ideals, purity, and purpose, which happens in the foreground of an absent God figure. The theater of the absurd then presents this inevitable devaluation through the use of poetic images, myths, rituals, and dream sequences. As a consequence, what is presented is a nihilist universe without an internal logic and the figure of man as lost within the quagmire of existence. Beckett, Ionesco, and Genet, as the most influential writers of this tradition, lay bare the fabric of nihilism through different modes of representation. So the first play that I'm going to take up is Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. In Waiting for Godot, Godot represents the figure of God according to one interpretation. In a universe set post God's death, two tramps, Vladimir and Estragon, are seen waiting for God, the master signifier, to arrive once again. The only certitude giving meaning to their life is the act of waiting they perform for Godot, who eludes them again and again in the two-act play. Both Vladimir and Estragon inhabit a nihilist universe devoid of all signification. Vladimir enters the stage when Estragon, giving up again, says, I quote, nothing to be done. The play then presents the paralysis of all meaningful action in wake of the non-meaning ascribed to life and the world. The stage space is overwhelmed with trivial actions, Estragon taking off his boots, Vladimir his hat, both deciding to part ways and never doing so, and contemplating suicide. Nothing sensical ever comes of the 80-page play except the nonsensical, marking the absurdity and irrationality of life. There is a recurring nostalgia and a debasement of the familiar Christian world in Waiting for Godot. According to Beckett's biographer, Anthony Cronin, Beckett always had a Bible, I quote, among the reference books on his shelves. There are a number of allusions to the Christian world in his various works that serve several purposes. Beckett doesn't always exalt the Christian God. He is, I quote, by turns dismissed, satirized, ignored, but he and his tortured son are never definitely discarded from his works. In Waiting for Godot, Vladimir is the one making reference to the Christian scriptures. He quotes from the proverb 13:12, I quote, hope defereth maketh something sick. In a godless universe, Beckett's characters seem to be perpetually confused as the old beliefs lose their meaning. However, rather than a radical disregard for their memory, both of them rely on its remnants that promise salvation. For example, when Vladimir talks of repentance, Estragon responds in the following way. So I'll quote the conversation. Estragon, what? Vladimir, suppose we repented. Estragon, repented what? This is followed by Vladimir narrating to Estragon the story of two thieves crucified with Christ, one of which was saved and the other damned, providing them with the ground for their own salvation. However, Vladimir mentions the four evangelists, that is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, out of whom only one, that is Luke, spoke of the saved thief in his account. Two of them do not mention the thieves, while one talks of thieves abusing the Christ. The conversation ensues thus. I quote the conversation. Vladimir, but all four were there, and only one speaks of the thief being saved. Why believe him rather than the others? Estragon, who believes him? Vladimir, everybody. It's the only version they know. Estragon, people are bloody ignorant apes. The doubt that Vladimir posits about the authority of the version of story that finds widespread readership over other versions explains Nietzschean nihilism as a system of power. In Nietzsche, the Christian ethics is nihilistic, for it exalts the afterlife over the life of constant becoming. This version of the story thereby serves an important purpose of submitting the people to the ideal of repentance and turn them against life, and in turn serves the likes of the religious clergy. However, the will to power as will to truth acts in the above case, where Vladimir, who momentarily seeks salvation in the traditional belief system, turning towards the relative and the political nature of the story, thus denying any objecting value to the ideal of repentance. Vladimir's nihilist condition acts as a transitional stage that Nietzsche so fervently talks about. One then asks if Waiting for Godot also represents a revaluation of values. If Vladimir and Estragon overcome their nihilist condition, Although Waiting for Godot presents a devaluation of certain values, it does not present a revaluation in the Nietzschean sense. Vladimir and Estragon are trapped indefinitely in their nihilist condition, confused and paralyzed by the circularity of their existence. The second scene ends with both of them still contemplating suicide, talking about parting ways and waiting for Godot's arrival. Vladimir and Estragon do not transform into a Dionysius all of a sudden, a yes-saying, virile, courageous, grand spirit. Beckett does not imagine such an end for his drams, it seems. So the second play that I'll be taking is The Chairs by Eugene Ionesco. Written in 1951 in French, The Chairs, subtitled A Tragic Farce, is a play about an aged couple who have been married for 75 years. Like Vladimir and Estragon, who are trapped in their circular existence, the old man and the old woman are physically trapped within what seems like a lighthouse, surrounded by water and darkness, and mentally within their banal existence. This is suggestive of a post-apocalyptic world where only the two have survived, while the master signifier for Vladimir and Estragon was the eternal wait for Godot. For old man and his wife, it is the delivery of the message, supposedly the meaning of life that the old man wants to deliver through the orator. Ionesco once wrote to the director of his play, Sylvain Dhome, that, I quote, "The subject of the play is not the message, nor the failure of life, not the moral disaster of the two old people, but the chairs themselves. That is to say, the absence of people, the absence of emperor, the absence of God, the absence of matter, the unreality of the world, the metaphysical emptiness. The theme of the play is nothingness. However, the concrete manifestations of nothingness on stage seem like a reflection of the larger breakdown of meaning and absence of ultimate values in life. The wasted life of the old man, the meaningless and absurd existence spanning through days with a broken memory and a sense of self, and the ever enlarging distance between the two presents the context for the physicalized absence of the guest on chair. All values, and not just the highest ones, have devalued themselves in the chairs. The breakdown of the fundamentals stem from the absent emperor figure, who is a metaphor for God. Portrayed as real yet invisible, he is a part of old man's delusions, trying to recreate the signifier that is absent and probably long dead. Dejected for not having this central figure define his life, the old man complains to the emperor, I quote, "I might have been something if I could have been sure of the support of your majesty. Rather, he's a nothing, a wasted life waiting for his end." Instead of the emperor, the orator is more real and yet shown to be dreamlike. The old woman says when the orator comes to the stage, I quote, "He exists. He's flesh and blood." The orator is symbolic of the meaning he's supposed to deliver, which is more existent than the absent God figure. However, this message is non-communicable as the orator is both deaf and mute. His inability signifies that the only meaning to life is its meaninglessness, and it is unavailable to any expression. Both the husband and wife commit suicide before it's revealed that the orator cannot deliver the message he has been commissioned for. Their suicide is a tragic consequence of the sheer arbitrariness of life, which is farcical as it ends with, which is also farcical, which as it ends with speeches and a bit of confetti. The chairs can be perused as an attempt towards devaluation of values. However, the most significant devaluation is of language itself as a meaningful way of communication. Ionesco in an interview said, I quote, "Beckett destroys language with silence. I do it with too much language, with characters talking at random and by inventing words." But does the chair present a reevaluation of language as a system? Ionesco employs neologisms, dissected words, concrete images, and sounds on stage to break the communication, but to also create an alternate signification of expressing the inexplicable. While language is revalued thematically, there is no revaluation of moral values that take place. One is compelled to ask the Nietzschean question, do the old man and the woman transcend nihilism? No, they do not. On the contrary, they commit suicide as a final act of redemption, something that even God could not provide, but the man does it for himself. So I come to the third play, that is The Balcony by Genet. Both Beckett and Ionesco present the absurdity of human condition in quite similar terms. The bare minimum setting of the scenes, the tramp-like characters who are at times teeter the edge of insanity, and deployment of debased language enable them to create a world on stage that is essentially godless. On the other hand, Jene recreates absurdity on stage through the dichotomy between reality and illusion. Unlike Beckett and Ionesco, whose plays essentially explored the existential condition bereft of any social or political angle, Jene's work is often intertwined with the political motive. Jene's characters are mainly the outcast, and the settings elaborate that lent a perception of illusion. The Balcony is a play where the major action takes place in the brothel, set against the backdrop of an outside world that is in disarray due to a revolution. The outside is symbolic of the nihilist condition of man, which is chaotic, which is unstable, which is disordered, meaningless, and absurd, while the brothel signifies order, certainty, and meaning, albeit illusionary. The action really moves to the outside world, and through its focus on the internal world of certain and absolute roles, it makes the outside world a constantly feared reality. Everyone comes to the House of Illusions to fulfill their fantasies of power that are otherwise vulnerable and impossible in the outside world, given its revolutionary state. Unable to face its meaninglessness and disorder, the nihilist seeks illusions in certain defined roles of the bishop, the judge, and the general, that are the power positions and affiliated values that Nietzsche seeks to undermine. These fictions provide man with a sense of momentary power, which a world stripped of God's presence has denied them. However, the momentary roles of power unfurl a deep-seated power dynamic that goes into their existence. The bishop commands to the penitent, I quote, "Our holiness lies only in our being able to forgive you your sins." The judge orders the thief, I quote, "A judge, I am going to be judge of your acts. On me depends the weighing, the balance. I cut it in two, the good, the bad." The idols of good and bad, the acts of forgiveness and salvation are mere values that serve the political purpose of of some few. These values deny life and make man a stranger to himself. However, these power roles are now only played in the house of illusions and denied in the outside world that is being built on the rubble of old values. The structures of power, like the palace, are being burned down. Someone informs that the queen is dead. The symbols of power and certainty are being destroyed through man's will to better ideals. However, no one seems to be in touch with the outside world. When the chief of the police inquires about the outside events, what is happening outside, the judge replies, "What you called outside is as mysterious to us as we are to it." Moreover, on the queen's death, Irma, the owner of the brothel, dresses as the queen. The absolute symbol of power crumbles in the nihilist world, but finds a whole new meaning in the illusionary world. The balcony, through the affirmation of the illusionary, denies the real nihilist world that is the new order. A final confirmation of the nihilist condition happens through Roger, the rebel, who comes to the House of Illusions in order to live through the character of the chief of police. He seeks refuge in the world of illusions when he says, I quote, "The house outside in which what you call life, everything has crashed. No truth was possible," signifying the nihilist condition of man. However, the rebel Roger castrates himself while playing the chief of police. The castration is symbolic of a man's act of severing all illusions of highest values and returning to the world of nothingness. The play then represents a shift from denial of nihilism to its recognition as real. However, like Waiting for Godot and the chairs, this condition does not lead to a re-evaluation in the Nietzschean sense. There is no overcoming the nihilist condition, rather a mere affirmation of it in the end via Roger's act of castration. So I'll conclude my paper here. God's death has had implications for almost every field of study, while existentially it has potentially threatened man's existence and ushered him into the abyss of nihilism. Nietzsche's nihilism, unlike Sartre's, acts as a political structure of power, instantiated in the Christian religious and moral system apart from the usual individualistic connotations. Beckett's Waiting for Godot, replete with biblical references, is an example of Nietzsche's nihilism as the existential condition of man and as a structure of power. While the chairs materializes the metaphysical nothingness on stage, that is a reflection of failing values, the balcony succeeds in recreating nihilism through the dichotomy of illusion and reality. The three playwrights bring the motif of God's death alive in their works with the trailing nihilism to which they fail to find a solution to. Rosetta C. Lamont remarked on the similar lines that, I quote, the theatre of the absurd shows the failure of man without recommending a solution. Vladimir and Estragon continue living a cyclical life. The old man and his wife commit suicide, and Irma's brothel continues to feed its customers with illusions. It is only Roger in the balcony who is seen to possess a will to at least accept the fictive cosmos and make an attempt to sever all relations with this world through his castration. However, he never arrives at overcoming his nihilism. Therefore, Theatre of the Absurd deals with the radical presentation of the nihilist universe of man, but rarely presents an overcoming of this condition. Perhaps Nietzsche was right when he proclaimed via his madman, I have come too early. Though the world at large and theatre of the absurd faces the nothingness of existence in its grotesqueness, the time to transcend this nihilism, however, has not yet come for both the man and the theatre.